The saloon door creaked in the wind, though no one had touched it. A gray sky hung low over the town of Dry Creek, and dust rolled lazy circles across the empty street. The hour was late, too late for folks to be out, yet a lone rider came pushing. Through the dusk, his horse moving slow but steady. From the porch of the general store, the old men smoking there turned their heads, watching the stranger approach. They weren't staring at the cowboy, though. It was the figure clinging behind him that made their pipes hang still in their mouths, an Apache woman, her dark hair loose, her eyes sharp yet weary as if she carried all the weight of 2 nations upon her shoulders. The cowboy, broad-shouldered and sunburned, slid down from his saddle, dust falling from his boots as if the desert had made its home on him. The woman followed, but with less grace, stumbling slightly when her bare feet touched the hard-packed dirt. She caught herself before she fell, straightened, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. There was silence in Dry Creek, the kind that belongs only to western towns where everyone measures a stranger. Before saying a word, whispers stirred among the onlookers. No one said it plain, but their eyes spoke enough. An Apache in town was trouble, and most knew it. Yet the woman did not shrink under their stares. She held her chin high, though her thin dress was worn, torn at the edges from long travel. Her voice cut through the hush, steady and filled with both fear and courage. "Hire me as your cook. I've nowhere to go." The words weren't spoken to the crowd. They were meant for the cowboy alone, the man who had carried her into town without question. He didn't answer right away. His eyes, the kind hardened by years under open skies, studied her. The townsfolk shifted, waiting to see what he would do, whether he'd cast her off or claim her under his roof. The cowboy's jaw worked as if he were chewing on more than tobacco. He had seen many desperate souls in his time, but something in her plea struck deeper. Maybe it was the quiet dignity behind her trembling voice. Maybe the way her hands clenched together, not begging but holding on to the last thread of pride she had. He thought of his ranch on the edge of nowhere, a lonely place with more silence than laughter, more emptiness than warmth. Yet to take her in was to invite trouble. He knew what whispers could turn into. He knew how quick a town like Dry Creek could turn hard against outsiders. Still, when her eyes met his, steady like a flame refusing to die, he felt something stir that he couldn't quite name. The old men on the porch spat in the dust, waiting. The blacksmith leaned in his doorway, arms folded, watching with quiet interest. Even the sheriff, leaning against his office wall, narrowed his gaze but didn't move. It was as though the whole town hung in that moment, waiting for the cowboy to decide. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned slightly, as if to measure the crowd, then back to her. Her shoulders were squared, though her frame looked fragile. He thought of the life he had lived, long days of riding fence, cold nights under a roof that never felt like home, mornings waking to silence broken only by the crow of a rooster. What would it hurt to give her a chance, he wondered? What would it hurt to share that silence with someone who needed shelter as badly as he did? But still, the risk pressed on him. A woman of her people, walking into a cowboy's life, would raise questions. Some would call it charity, others would call it betrayal. In a land where grudges ran deeper than rivers, even the smallest act of kindness could spark fire. She must have seen the battle in his eyes because she stepped closer, her voice softer now but still clear. "I can work. I can cook, mend, tend. A home. All I ask is a place where I belong." The cowboy swallowed. He could turn her away, leave her to the mercy of a desert that gave none. He could ride off, alone again. That would be the easy road, the safe one. Yet he felt the weight of her words sink into him, words that carried more than hunger. They carried a history of loss, of survival, of someone who had stood against storms fiercer than the wind now blowing down the street. Finally, he spoke. His voice quiet but strong. "Come with me." The crowd murmured, uneasy. Some shook their heads. Others simply watched with the stillness of those who had seen enough of life to know better than to interfere. The woman's face did not soften with relief. Instead, she nodded once, almost solemn, as though she had known this was the only choice he could make. Still, her eyes held something gratitude, perhaps, but also a guardedness, as if trust could not be given so easily, not after all she had endured. He reached for her bundle, the small sack she carried, worn and patched but holding the last pieces of her life. For a moment, their hands brushed, and though neither spoke of it, something passed between them, an unspoken promise, or maybe just the beginning of one. The cowboy turned, leading his horse toward the edge of town where the desert stretched, endless and silent. She followed, her steps firm despite the weariness in her body. Behind them, the town returned to its murmur, though the whispers would follow them long after dawn. As they moved down the road, the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of sage and dust, the sound of coyotes calling in the distance. The land was wide, unforgiving, but in that vastness lay the chance of something new. Still, as they walked into the fading light, neither spoke of what lay ahead. The cowboy knew trouble would come from the town, from the past, maybe even from within himself. The woman knew safety was never certain, not even under the roof of a man who had shown her mercy, and so they rode on, two souls bound by a fragile thread of chance, stepping into a future as uncertain as the desert night that waited for them. What would come of it? Neither could say. But one thing was sure, the story of the cowboy and the Apache woman had only just begun, and the road ahead was far from kind. Would his home truly shelter her, or would the world beyond their door tear it apart? That answer lay somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting for them both. The trail leading out of Dry Creek stretched into rolling emptiness, where shadows of the hills seemed to swallow the road whole. The cowboy rode ahead, his figure steady against the fading light, while the Apache woman walked just behind him, her bare feet silent in the dust. She carried no complaints, no words of weariness, only the steady rhythm of someone who had long ago learned that silence could be stronger than speech. The cowboy kept glancing back, not out of doubt but to measure the distance in her eyes. He saw how she never faltered, never begged for him to slow, though her thin frame showed the marks of hunger and hardship. It reminded him of himself in some strange way, years ago when he had been cast adrift, learning to carve a life from the unforgiving land. Perhaps that was why her plea had struck him so deeply. She wasn't asking for pity. She was asking for a chance to live with dignity. By the time the outline of his ranch rose on the horizon, the stars had begun to scatter above them. The small cabin stood lonesome, its wood weathered from years of wind and storm, the corral half empty except for a few restless horses. The land around it stretched in silence, broken only by the rustle of dry grass and the cry of an owl. To most, it looked like nothing more than a hard life waiting. To him, it was home. He dismounted and tied his horse at the rail. She stopped at the edge of the yard, her eyes roaming the place as though measuring whether it would accept her or not. He noticed the way her shoulders stiffened, as though she were ready to be turned away even now. He walked back toward her, his boots crunching in the dirt, and said, "It ain't much, but it's honest. You'll have food and a roof." She nodded once, not lowering her gaze. "That is more than I've had in a long while." He opened the door for her, and the creak of the hinges carried into the night. Inside, the cabin was plain, with a small hearth, a rough wooden table, and shelves stacked with jars and tins. The air smelled of leather and smoke, the scent of a man living alone too long. She stepped inside quietly, setting her small bundle by the wall. He saw her glance at the shelves, at the pots and pans left dusty, and knew she was already thinking of how to bring life back into the place. He sat at the table, pulling off his hat, watching her as she moved about slowly, cautious as though afraid of breaking something that was not hers. Finally, he said, "You never told me your name." She paused, her hands brushing lightly across the wooden counter. "My people called me Ayoka." The sound of it carried, wait, a name tied to generations he could never know. He repeated it under his breath, testing the sound. She did not smile, but there was a faint softening in her eyes, as if hearing it spoken aloud gave her a piece of herself back. For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled, and outside the wind pressed against the walls. He thought of how the town would talk by morning, how the whispers would twist into sharp words, how men with nothing better to do would spit on the ground when they spoke his name. Yet, as he looked at her standing there, straight back despite her exhaustion, he wondered when he had last cared for what the town thought. Ayoka began to stir the fire, her movements quiet but sure, and soon the smell of beans filled the cabin. He hadn't realized how long it had been since someone else had cooked in his home. Watching her, he felt something unsettled inside him. Not fear exactly, but the kind of stirring that comes when a man knows he is walking into change. The next days fell into a strange rhythm. At dawn she was awake before him, already moving through the cabin with a quiet grace. She cleaned what had been left untouched for years, mended his shirts with careful stitches, and worked in the kitchen as though she had always belonged there. Her hands were quick, her back unbending, and though she spoke little, her presence filled the silence in ways he hadn't expected. The cowboy spent his hours out on the range, riding fence lines and tending to cattle. Yet when he returned, the cabin no longer greeted him with stillness. There was always the smell of food, a fire burning steady, and the sight of her by the hearth, her dark eyes lifting when he entered. He found himself waiting for those small moments, though he never admitted it aloud, but not all was peaceful. The first time he rode into town again, the stares were heavier than before. Men on the porch of the saloon leaned forward, muttering, while the women at the mercantile turned away in whispers. The blacksmith grunted as he passed, and even the sheriff gave him a long look that carried more warning than words. He said nothing, bought his supplies, and rode back out. But the weight of their judgment followed him like a shadow. When he reached the cabin, he found Ayoka at the well, drawing water. She looked up at him, and though he hadn't spoken of the town, she seemed to know. She always seemed to know. "They will not forget who I am," she said quietly. He dismounted, setting down his supplies, and after a moment he answered, "Let them remember. What matters is here, not there." Yet deep down, he wondered how long he could shield her from the hatred that brewed beyond the hills. The land was unforgiving enough without carrying the burden of men's grudges. At night, the unease settled heavier. Coyotes howled across the plain, their cries echoing like ghosts. He would lie awake, staring at the rafters, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing from the other side of the room. There was comfort in it, yet also a reminder that the line between them and the world outside was thin. One evening, after a long day of riding fence, he returned to find her standing by the doorway, watching the horizon. The sunset cast a red glow over the land, painting her face in shadows. "They will come," she said, her voice low. He stopped, frowning. "Who?" "Those who do not want me here. Those who see only what I was born, not who I am." He looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't speaking in fear. She was speaking in certainty, the kind that comes from living through storms before. He tightened his jaw. "If they come, they'll find I don't scare easy." Her gaze shifted. To him then, steady and unblinking, and he felt the weight of her trust, or perhaps it was a test. He didn't know which, but he knew the days ahead would demand more of him than silence and grit. The ranch grew warmer under her care, but the outside world pressed closer. Each trip to town sharpened the tension. he began to notice strangers. Lingering too long at the edge of his land, riders passing slow along the trail. He said nothing to her, but she noticed the set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested closer to his rifle. One night, as the fire burned low, she finally spoke of her past. Her voice was quiet, but every word was sharp as flint. She told of her family driven from their home, of hunger and loss, of wandering with nothing but will to keep her alive. She did not cry, she did not falter. When she finished, she only said, "That is why I will not leave again. I will not wander." He listened in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. Her words sank into him like stone. Into earth, anchoring something he had not realized was drifting. The night stretched long, and when he finally closed his eyes, he knew the choice he had made the day she spoke her plea in town was no longer just an act of kindness. It had become something deeper, something that bound his fate with hers in ways neither of them could escape. But as dawn neared and the coyotes fell silent, the cowboy also knew this trouble was coming, drawn by the whispers of Dry Creek, by the grudges of men who refused to forget. And when it came, it would test not only his strength, but the fragile hope that had begun to grow between him and the woman who carried both fire and sorrow in her eyes. The prairie held its breath, waiting, as though the land itself knew their story was about to shift. What lay beyond the horizon was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the peace they had built was only a pause before the storm. The storm did not arrive all at once. It came first in whispers carried on the wind, in the uneasy way men at the Tindilo saloon spoke the cowboy's name with a curl of bitterness, in the narrowed eyes of ranchers who had once traded handshakes but now looked away. Trouble had a way of brewing slow on the frontier, like a pot left too long over the fire, and both he and Ioka could feel the heat rising even before the first spark showed itself. One evening, while he was fixing a section of fence near the far end of the property, a rider appeared on the ridge. The figure sat motionless for a long while, watching. The cowboy kept working, his hand steady though his heart beat harder, and when he finally looked up again, the rider was gone. Later that night, he told Ioka what he had seen. She said nothing at first, just stirred the fire, her dark eyes catching the flames. Then she said, "They are not just watching you. They are watching me. To them, I am the reason to test you." Her words settled heavy in the cabin, and though he wanted to tell her she was wrong, he knew she wasn't. Out here, grudges traveled faster than horses, and fear was stronger than truth. The days that followed brought new signs. Tools left in the barn were moved. The latch on the corral was found unhooked one morning, and a section of water trough had been split as though struck by an axe. These were not accidents. They were warnings. The cowboy kept his rifle closer, but he told no one. The fewer words spoken, the longer he might hold the line. Yet he could not hide the truth from Ioka. She saw the worry in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the horizon before he saddled his horse. At night, when the fire burned low, she would sit near the window, watching the darkness as though expecting figures to step out at any moment. She had lived long enough to know the difference between silence and danger, and she carried her watchfulness. Like armor while tension grew on the ranch, the town itself spun with whispers. The blacksmith had once spoken friendly to the cowboy, but now when they crossed paths, his words were clipped. The sheriff, who prided himself on keeping peace, hinted one afternoon that bringing her kind into his home was asking for trouble. Even the storekeeper's wife, who had once offered him extra cloth for repairs, now avoided his eyes as though his choices were catching. But not everyone stood against them. A young ranch hand named Will, who worked land just south of the cowboys' range, still tipped his hat and spoke kindly. He even offered to ride along the fence one day when he heard about the broken trough. "Not everyone's got their mind turned sour," he said, Some of us know you for the man you are, not the stories they tell." The cowboy thanked him, though he knew Will's loyalty might cost the young man dearly if the town turned harder. Meanwhile, Ayoka carried herself with quiet resolve. She refused to let fear show in her hands or voice. She tended the garden, learned the rhythm of the ranch, and filled the cabin with small signs of care. Yet he could see the strain in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He wondered how many times in her life she had been forced to carry the weight of others' hatred, and how many more times she could bear it before it broke her spirit. One evening, she told him a story. She spoke of a river where her people had once camped, where children laughed and the air was filled with songs. Then she told how soldiers had come, how the camp had scattered, and how she had wandered alone after. Her voice never rose, but in her steady tone he could hear both sorrow and strength. When she finished, she said, "I will not lose another place. Not this one." Her words struck him harder than the warnings in town. He realized then that this ranch, plain and weathered though it was, had become more than his home. It had become her last hope for belonging. And if he failed to protect it, he would not only lose his land but also the fragile bond they had begun to build. The conflict deepened when a group of riders approached the ranch late one afternoon. Dust trailed behind them as they came down the slope, their hats pulled low, their horses restless. The cowboy stepped out to meet them, his rifle leaning against the doorway though his hand stayed loose at his sides. The men stopped short of the yard, their leader calling out, "We came to speak plain. That woman don't belong here. Send her away and we'll forget the rest." Ayoka stood just inside the cabin, her figure framed by the glow of the fire. She did not move, but her presence was strong enough to weigh on the air. The cowboy's voice carried steady as he answered, "This is my land. Who lives here is my choice. You want to speak against it, you'll have to do more than shout from a saddle." The leader scowled, spit into the dirt, and after a tense silence, turned his horse. "You'll regret it," he said before riding off. The others followed, leaving only the dust to settle. That night, Ayoka sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. "They will come again," she said. He nodded, knowing she was right. From then on, life at the ranch took on a sharper edge. Every chore was done with eyes open. Every ride across the range felt heavier with the thought of who might be watching. The cowboy began teaching Ayoka how to handle his rifle. She was no stranger to weapons, and though she preferred quiet work, she listened carefully, her hands steady as she learned to load and aim. "If the time comes, I will not stand helpless," she told him, her eyes fierce in the FIRELIGHT. As days passed, subplots of the conflict grew. Will, the young ranch hand, began to face pressure from other ranchers. They told him he ought not to stand beside a man who harbored an Apache under his roof. Still, he visited when he could, bringing news from town and lending a hand when work grew heavy. His loyalty hinted at a brewing choice of his own, one that might draw him deeper into the storm. The sheriff, too, walked a dangerous line. Though he warned the cowboy against trouble, there were moments when his eyes betrayed doubt, as if he questioned the righteousness of the town's anger. Whether he would act on that doubt or bend to the louder voices remained to be seen. Through it all, Ayoka grew into the life she had claimed. She planted seeds near the cabin, mended saddles with a skill that surprised him, and even tamed a pavan, young colt that had thrown every hand who tried. Yet the more she built, the more there was to lose, and the cowboy felt the stakes tightening around them like a rope. The land itself seemed to mirror the tension. Storm clouds gathered more often. Winds tore across the plains, and the nights grew restless with the cries of coyotes. The cabin felt both like a fortress and a trap, a place where safety and danger pressed against each other in silence. One night, As the storm winds howled, the cowboy stood by the window, watching the lightning split the sky. Ayoka joined him, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if the land itself tests us? If it waits to see who will bend and who will stand?" He looked at her, seeing the firelight on her face, the determination that refused to yield. "Maybe," he said. "But I reckon the land don't choose who belongs. That's for us to decide." She nodded, though her gaze did not leave the horizon. The storm outside raged on, and within the cabin, a storm of another kind brewed quietly, waiting for its hour to break dot in the days ahead. More riders would come, more whispers would grow, and the ranch would become not just a home but a battleground of belonging, pride, and survival. Neither of them spoke it aloud, but they both knew this fight was far from over, and the hardest part had yet to begin. The days grew sharper as autumn crept across the plains. The wind carried a bite now, and the nights were longer, darker, filled with the weight of waiting. Trouble had not broken through the door yet, but it circled closer each day, like wolves pacing just outside the firelight. The cowboy felt it in the quiet between chores, in the restless stirring of the horses, in the way Ayoka's eyes lingered on the horizon as though she could see danger moving long before he did. The ranch no longer felt like just land and fences. It was a line drawn in the dust, a stand against the world beyond. And though the cowboy had always lived with the loneliness of open spaces, now he carried the burden of knowing he was no longer standing only for himself. Every decision, every ride into town, every word spoken or withheld was tied to her fate as much as his. On his next trip into Dry Creek, the tension was undeniable. The saloon doors swung open as he passed, and a group of men stepped out, their boots striking the boards heavy. They didn't say his name, but their eyes told the story plain. At the general store, the keeper counted his coins with slow reluctance, as though the silver burned to touch. And at the edge of town, the sheriff stopped him with a hand raised. "You're making it harder than it needs to be," the sheriff said, his voice low but firm. "They won't let this rest. Every week that woman stays under your roof, the anger grows." The cowboy met his eyes, calm but unyielding. "She ain't a woman they get to decide about. She's here, and she stays." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "You've got more grit than sense sometimes." "Just? No grit don't stop bullets." The warning hung heavy in his ears as he rode back out. He thought of Ayoka waiting at the cabin, of the fire she kept burning, of the steadiness in her gaze. He knew the storm would come, and he knew he'd have no choice but to meet it head on. Back at the ranch, Ayoka sensed the weight he carried, though he said little. She did not ask questions. Instead, she moved through the cabin with quiet determination, preparing for what both of them knew was near. She stored dried food, stacked wood high against the wall, and kept the rifle cleaned and ready. Her actions spoke louder than words. She had no intention of running, no matter what came. But the strain showed in other ways. At night, when the firelight flickered across her face, there was a tension in her jaw, a watchfulness that never seemed to fade. Sometimes she would walk the yard long after the cowboy had turned in, her steps soft in the dirt, her eyes scanning the darkness. When he asked why she stayed out so late, she only answered, "Because they are already close." Her certainty unsettled him. She had lived through losses he could not imagine, seen dangers he could barely grasp. If she believed the threat was near, then it was. The first real strike came not at the ranch but on the trail. One morning, while checking cattle, he found 2 steers shot dead near the creek, their carcasses left to rot. The message was clear: his land, his herd, his livelihood, none of it was safe. He dragged the animals away, cursing under his breath, but he said nothing when he returned. Ayoka saw the shadow in his eyes and asked no questions. Though she tightened the string on her bow that night, her fingers testing the draw with calm precision. Days later, the young ranch hand Will came riding fast, his face drawn with worry. He dismounted at the cabin, speaking quick. "They're talking in town. A group's planning to ride this way soon. I don't know when, but it won't be long. You've got to be ready." The cowboy gripped his shoulder. "You did right telling me. But you best keep your distance now. Don't draw their fire for my fight." Will shook his head. "You gave me a hand once when I had nothing. I won't forget that. If they come, I'll ride with you." The cowboy's chest tightened with both gratitude and fear. He knew what it meant for a young man to stand against his own neighbors. He didn't try to argue, but he knew Will's loyalty might cost him dearly. After Will left, the cowboy told Ayoka of the warning. She listened without flinching, her eyes steady on the fire. When he finished, she said, "They think they can scare you. They think they can scare me. But they forget I have already lost everything once. I do not fear losing again. I only fear not fighting when I must." Her words burned into him, stronger than any oath. He realized then that this was not just his fight to protect her. It was hers to protect the life she had begun to build, fragile though it was. The nights grew heavier after that. Every sound outside made the horses restless. Every flicker of light on the horizon stirred unease. They began keeping watch in turns, one tending the fire while the other scanned the darkness through the cracks in the shutters. Sleep came only in stolen hours, light and uneasy. One night, just before dawn, the sound of distant hooves reached the cabin. The cowboy rose, hand on his rifle, while Ayoka gripped the bow she had strung by the hearth. They waited in silence, breath held, but the sound faded before it reached the yard. It was only a test, he knew, a reminder that the riders were near, circling like vultures. The days that followed were filled with a tense quiet. Work on the ranch continued, but every task felt shadowed. When he rode the fence line, he found fresh tracks along the ridge, too many to be stray travelers. When Ayoka fetched water from the well, she returned quickly, her eyes scanning the hills. Even the land seemed to hold its breath, as though the earth itself knew a breaking point was close. Then, late one afternoon, the storm broke open. A dust cloud rose on the horizon, carrying with it the sound of many riders. The cowboy saw it first, standing at the edge of the corral. His hand tightened on the rail, his jaw set. He turned to Ayoka, who stood in the doorway, her face calm, though her eyes burned with fire. "They're coming," he said. She stepped forward, bow in hand, her voice steady. "Then let them find us ready." The sound grew louder, the ground trembling under the weight of hooves. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land. The cowboy checked his rifle, the metal cold in his hands, while Ayoka set arrows within reach. The air inside the cabin thickened with silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire dot. In that moment, time seemed to slow. He thought of the day she had first spoken her plea in town, of the weight in her voice when she said she had nowhere else to go. He thought of the long rides, the quiet nights, the small bond that had grown between them. And he knew this fight was not just about land or pride, it was about keeping the one fragile chance at belonging they had found together. The thunder of hooves drew closer, the shouts of men rising above the wind. Shadows broke across the ridge, riders fanning out as they came down toward the cabin. Dust swirled in the air, stinging the eyes, carrying the bitter smell of anger. The cowboy stepped to the doorway, rifle steady, while Ayoka took her place. At the window, the yard filled with the sound of approaching fury, and for a heartbeat, the world held still, the storm on the edge of breaking. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. The moment had come, and the weight of all that had built before pressed down upon them. The riders drew near, their voices sharp, their intent clear. The ground shook under the power of their charge, and the cabin stood as the last thin barrier against them. The cowboy's finger tightened on the trigger. Ayoka's bowstring drew taut, and the world narrowed to this one breath, this one instant. Before the clash, the storm had arrived, and there was no turning back. The first shot split the air sharp as lightning. The riders had come in a rush, but the cowboy was steady, his rifle cracking once, then again, each shot echoing across the valley. Ayoka loosed her arrows from the window, swift and precise, each finding its mark in the dust before the riders. Horses reared, men shouted, the charge broken for a moment. The yard filled with smoke and the bitter smell of powder, the sound of hooves scattering as the attackers pulled back to regroup. The cowboy ducked inside, his chest rising hard but his voice calm. They're not finished. They'll circle. And come again. Ayoka wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes sharp with fire. Then we will stand again. The storm outside raged with the shouts of men gathering in the shadows, but inside the cabin, a strange calm grew between them. They were no longer just defending land. They were defending the fragile bond that had taken root, the sense of belonging. Neither had known before. The second wave came fiercer. Bullets cracked against the cabin walls, splinters flying, glass shattering from the small window. The cowboy returned fire, careful, deliberate, each shot carrying the weight of survival. Ayoka moved like she had always belonged in that fight, her bow steady, her courage unshaken. Then, through the dust, came the leader. His voice cut across the chaos, loud and bitter. She doesn't belong here. Give her up, and this ends. The cowboy stepped into the doorway, his face set, his rifle steady at his shoulder. She belongs here more than any of you. This land's ours to live on, and no man tells me who I can share it with. The words rang clear, stronger than the gunfire. For a moment, silence fell, the riders hesitating. In that pause, Will appeared, riding hard from the south, his horse lathered, his rifle in hand. He skidded to a halt beside the cabin and shouted, "You'll have to come through me too." The riders shifted, their numbers strong but fair. Resolve wavering. The fight had already cost them, and now the stand was growing against them. The leader cursed, spitting into the dirt, then jerked his reins. "This ain't over," he growled before turning his horse. One by one, the others followed, their dust cloud fading into the horizon. The silence that followed was heavier than the fight itself. The cowboy lowered his rifle, his arms trembling only now that the danger had passed. Ayoka stepped from the cabin, her bow still in hand, her face calm though her eyes carried the weight of what they had just faced. Will slid down from his horse, his chest heaving, his young face pale but proud. "They'll be back," Will said quietly. The cowboy nodded. "Maybe, but they know now we won't bend." That night, the cabin glowed with firelight, not from fear but from survival. The three of them sat together, sharing food, speaking little but knowing much had been decided. Ayoka finally broke the silence, her voice soft but strong. "This place will not be taken from us, not by words, not by fear." In the days that followed, the ranch settled back into rhythm, though nothing was quite the same. The fence was mended where bullets had struck, the windows patched, the land tended as it had been before. Yet everything carried the mark of change, the sense that they had passed through a trial and come out not untouched, but unbroken. Word spread through town of what had happened. Some men still spat when the cowboy's name was spoken, but others began to look at him with a new kind of respect, grudging but steady. Will's loyalty was no longer questioned, and the sheriff, though he never said it plain, carried himself different around them, as though he had seen where true strength lay. For Ayoka, the ranch became more than shelter. She planted her garden wider, her hands working the soil with purpose. She tamed the young colt fully, her calm patience turning the restless animal into a trusted companion. She moved through each day with quiet pride, her place no longer shadowed by doubt. The land had claimed her, and she had claimed it in return. The cowboy found himself watching her often, not with surprise anymore, but with a steady recognition that his life had been changed in ways he hadn't expected. He thought back to the day she had stood in the street of Dry Creek, her voice breaking through the silence with a plea to be taken in. He realized now that moment had not only given her a home, but had given him something he hadn't known he was missing, a reason. Beyond himself to fight, to build, to endure. The seasons turned, and with them the land shifted. Winter brought cold winds, but the cabin held warmth, filled with the smell of food and the sound of quiet voices. Spring brought new growth, the garden sprouting green, the herd strong again. With each passing day, the memory of that storm night faded, though its lesson never did. One evening, as the sun fell low and painted the sky in gold, the cowboy stood at the edge of the corral, watching Ayoka as she worked among the rows she had planted. The sight filled him with a deep stillness, a peace that came not from the absence of conflict, but from having faced it and stood firm. Doppel rode up then, bringing news from town. "It's quieter now," he said, leaning on his saddle horn. "Some still talk, but most have let it lie. Maybe they've seen enough not to test you again." The cowboy nodded, his eyes still on Ayoka. "Let them talk. What matters is here." Will smiled faintly, tipping his hat before riding off. The cowboy stayed, his hands resting on the rail, his heart steady with the weight and ease of belonging. When Ayoka joined him, her hands still carrying the scent of earth, she looked at the horizon and then at him. "The land has tested us," she said, her voice quiet, "and we are still standing." He met her gaze, and for the first time in years, he felt not the emptiness of the plains but the fullness of life shared. The hardships were not gone, nor would they ever be, but they had carved something out of the dust that was stronger than fear. The ranch was no longer just his. It was theirs, bound by struggle, held by choice, and strengthened by the courage to endure. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the cowboy and Ayoka stood side by side, the air calm, the earth steady beneath their feet. The storm had passed, the whispers of the town had faded, and what remained was a life forged not by chance, but by will. The story that had begun with a plea in the dusty street of Dry Creek had found its ending here, not in surrender, but in quiet triumph. And as the stars came out, scattered bright against the dark sky, the ranch stood silent, strong, a testament to what could be built when two souls refused to yield. The prairie stretched wide and endless, but within it, they had found a home, a place where belonging had taken root. The land carried its hardships still, but now it also carried their promise that no storm, no whisper, no shadow of the past would ever take away what they had claimed together. And so the cowboy and the Apache woman lived on in that hard land, not as outcasts, not as wanderers, but as those who had faced the storm and chosen to remain. The prairie kept their story, written not in books but in the soil itself, a tale of survival, courage, and the quiet strength of belonging.